here's a topic that comes up a lot when I talk to internal comms, HR, learning and development, especially leadership development folks at corporations. It's this idea of what they call the human leader or humanizing leaders. It always makes me laugh when I hear that. But what they mean by that is the most effective and maybe even the most successful leaders are the ones who are authentic. They're not afraid to be authentic. They're not afraid to be vulnerable. And because think about it, most leaders, they feel like they want to be perfect. They want to say everything perfect. If they're going to do something like this, they want to have a teleprompter, and they want it to be edited, and it has to come out where they look like they've made no mistakes. But on the other side, the human leader, so to speak, wouldn't mind making a couple mistakes, wouldn't mind mumbling over their words a little. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be scripted. So what I always recommend to these folks for their leaders, and even for emerging leaders, is that they encourage them to start a podcast, especially an internal one for employees, or it could be even for employees, or it could be a private one for customers where, very select audience gets to listen to it. But the focus of that podcast would be for the leader to learn about things that they know nothing about or very little about. So that vulnerability and that authenticity is built in. So for example, I always tell them, start a podcast, and you could steal this idea or, give me a call. We could talk about it, but start a podcast called ABC. Always be curious, because that's something every employee should be, but you never really get to hear the leader or leaders of your company being curious. Like, what does that mean? So imagine if you had a leader bringing on guests that are in areas that they know nothing about. So there could be, ChatGPT 4 is emerging right now, and a lot of leaders aren't all that familiar with it. So imagine a conversation where a leader of the company is asking questions about that, speaking with an expert about that. That vulnerability, those questions are going to show that leader's vulnerability. Have a leader I'm a big cross-pollinator, where I love to look at outside industries and areas and fields and try to connect the dots back to companies' objectives or priorities. So maybe you bring in some just disparate people that you would never think that the leader of your company would talk to. So for example, a pit crew, a racing pit crew. What could your company learn from a racing pit crew? And you laugh, but there's things that you can learn from industries that seem very disparate and very disconnected from your own. But those are the kinds of conversations that a leader, they have to be vulnerable because they just don't know the answers. And that would be so amazing for employees or customers to hear, even for candidates to hear, because they'll want to work for a company where the leader isn't afraid to say, look, I don't know about this and I want to learn. And it would encourage them to be curious as well. So that's always my recommendation, is to do a podcast like that. Allow your leader to have those conversations, allow them to be vulnerable where they are their authentic selves. Tell them not to be afraid of it. That's part of being a human leader, is you don't know everything. It's sort of like being the kid in class. And you might remember this from your school days, where there was always that kid, and it might have been you, that raised their hand and asked the stupid question. And everybody kind of giggled because that question, oh, that's such a stupid question. But lo and behold, at the end of that class, somebody either came up to you, if you were that kid, or somebody else. You might have went up to them and said, thanks for asking that, because I didn't know the answer either. It's that same thing. That kid was vulnerable. That kid was authentic. It's the same sentiment if you do that with your leaders. So encourage your leaders to be vulnerable, to be authentic, and maybe do that by having them do a podcast where they can always be curious.